Willem Dafoe plays the Green Goblin in this movie. Dafoe of the movie. Get it? He's Dafoe. Isn't that funny? Isn't that hilarious? No! No one says no to me! The following is an in-depth story analysis. If you haven't seen this film, you might want to before watching and listening to this review. Welcome, everybody. Thanks for jumping back in to Superhero Rewind Unscripted. Today, we're going to tackle Spider-Man from 2002, which is a movie that I did a really early rewind on way back in, I believe, 2009. This was in at least the first couple of years when reviews had to be 10 minutes on YouTube, and I didn't really review the movie so much as say, here are the things that I think that future movies in the franchise in rebooting, because we had just gotten the announcement for Amazing Spider-Man. Here are the things that I think should be run with from this movie, and here are the things that I think were missteps that it should avoid. And so I've never really done a rewind actually breaking down a lot of the pros and cons and thematic stuff and character stuff in this movie. So I've done commentaries and stuff. So I've talked a lot about this movie, but I've never done it in the rewind format such as it has become. So here I am, and this was chosen by the Rewind Selection Board on Patreon. Quick plug for that. At the $10 tier, you can become a Patreon producer, and one of the perks that you get there is you get to help me pick reviews, and I put up a poll about 5 different superhero movies that I had done early on, and Spider-Man won that poll. So this is a thing that I meant to talk about last week when I did a requested review. Of course, not a superhero thing, but I did Rewind requested last week on Attack of the Clones, and weirdly, and I did not plan this, I just put Spider-Man there because it was one of those early reviews that is not great and is only a few minutes long, but both of those movies came out in 2002, in the same year, and this is the 20th anniversary for both of them, and I have not heard or seen a whole lot of fanfare for either of those things. I suppose maybe No Way Home was kind of a backdoor celebration of the anniversary, and it's not a thing I really remember hearing anybody talk about, even though that movie made a bazillion dollars. But anyway, it's kind of neat that both of these things just happened to come up on the 20th anniversary, and it was also kind of fun to watch this, and it had been a little while just after doing Attack of the Clones, because certainly compared to that movie, this relationship-wise looks like a, I don't know, fill in the blank, any great superhero relationship looks like, and I realize it's not a superhero movie, but immediately heightens the material, a Superman and Lois, not the TV show, but they're good in that too, but from the 1978 movie, or the relationship in Deadpool, or even, Bruce and Rachel. Suddenly, I like Mary Jane and Peter Parker a whole lot more right after seeing the horrible relationship again with Anakin and Padme in Attack of the Clones. But I think, honestly, I've been harder on the relationship stuff in all 3 of these in the whole trilogy. Hard not to lump all of it together. Mostly because of the missteps I feel like it made, that Raimi and the writers made in 2 and 3. They're a lot more likable here, more so than I remembered, and I will talk about that as we go along. But I wanted to start with my kind of personal history with this movie and with and its relation to Rewind and all of that. So I started Rewind just 7 years after this movie came out, which is crazy. And I think even at that point, we were, just off the heels, I guess, a couple of years from 3, which I thought was real rough and didn't care for at all. And I don't think I really cared that much if there was a Spider-Man 4. I didn't feel like it was completely unsalvageable, but I disliked the relationship with Mary Jane and Peter Parker so much that I didn't want to see any more of it ever again. And back then I complained that it wasn't really time for a reboot and that we were rushing and I think I was right about it, that fans were not ready to move on, the mainstream wasn't ready to move on, and if you were going to reboot it, it needed a few years. It needed kind of the Batman and Robin to Batman Begins thing. Wait at least 4, 5, 6 years. And I guess it was 5 overall, but I mean, when that was first announced, it just seemed so close, and it's true that maybe it needed 10 years, I don't know. It's true that people were not ready to move on from that, and I think the first Amazing Spider-Man might have been better received had it been a little bit longer out from the Raimi movies, because, and this is a thing that I've never fully related to, but people have... I almost said used to have, I still love Batman 89, but I don't think it's necessarily the definitive Batman on screen. Might still be the definitive costume, but a lot of people, like millennials that grew up with those movies, have what I had with Batman 89, where it's difficult to be critical of it. It's just such a part of the cultural lexicon and of their upbringing, and that Spider-Man for them, and kind of superhero movies in general for a lot of folks. And so really difficult to just, throw away your childhood and move on to another version, another iteration, that with Amazing Spider-Man was doing a lot of the same things. It's kind of weird just how much of this movie actually is in Amazing Spider-Man, and I'm not going to get into all of that because I don't want to make this just another comparison contrast with the Spider-Man movies. I am going to do some comparison contrast to some other stuff here in a minute, though. But anyway, I say all of that to say that I never really appreciated a lot of fans' love for this movie, like a lot of years later. Like, I always really enjoyed this, and I used to think 2 was one of the best superhero movies ever made. I don't really have that anymore. It might be interesting at some point to revisit that as well and see if I have different feelings doing the fine-tooth comb thing with it again. I think the review I did on that is okay, and it's long enough, but I may do it again just to see how differently I feel about it. Now that we're in this kind of more flexible podcast format, I feel like sometimes it might be worth going back and revisiting anything that it's just been a long time. I could see even going back and looking at Watchmen again after all of the more recent Snyder stuff to see if I'm still as in love with that movie, because that's been a long time. But going back, I mean, I watched this again probably 6 or 7 months ago, or has it been a year? I forget, for a show that I did with my son Jason, and was kind of taken aback by just how much I enjoyed it, because what I started to say earlier is 7 years after this movie came out, and again, just a couple years after 3, when I started Rewind, I was getting really lukewarm on this first movie and feeling like we'd really moved past it, that like it was pretty dated, even though it had only been a few years, and we were finally making more sophisticated superhero movies that were for not just people that liked comics and wanted an adaptation of those characters, but people who just liked movies that were like real films. And going back to this, I feel like I'm swinging kind of all the way back around again. There's a timeless quality to this that I feel like I picked up on the last couple times I've seen it, that I wasn't appreciating or didn't resonate with me before, because as I've always said, you're never exactly the same person from moment to moment or year to year, and all things are relative. So it's difficult not to have different feelings about a thing once you've experienced a lot of other things, both good and bad. And as I'm getting older, there's a real simplicity and charm to this, and that's a thing that you'll hear echoed later in some of the tweet-length reviews, that I really kind of miss. There's a lack of pretense, nothing is taken for granted, it feels like a big event, but it's not too big for his britches, right? Like, it has a lot of ambition, especially in trying to finally put something on screen that was not really viable before. This movie was in limbo, or a Spider-Man movie of some kind was in development hell for like 20 years. It moved from company to company. At one point, Canon had it, and it was a lot later before Sony finally did. You had a lot of different directors that almost made a Spider-Man movie in the 80s and the 90s. Roger Corman almost did one. James Cameron almost did one. The script that ultimately became this movie, for a while, almost still had Cameron's name on it because it was Sony got the rights to particularly that treatment, and it was supposed to be based on that. And I think, and I'm not sure what exactly, and I've never read his script, or I've never read all of his script. I want to do, by the way, more unmade scripts. I say more. I've talked about unmade scripts on the channel, but never on a rewind. I'd like to do some of those, or a series on those at some point, and that might be one to look at. I don't know if there's a full script or a treatment. I can't remember. I know I've read bits and pieces of it. But anyway, only a couple of elements were taken from his treatment or script to go to this, and it seems like what Raimi made was a lot more true to the source material and was made by somebody who just appreciated Spider-Man comics a lot more and really took it back to basics, and I think that's a lot of why this ended up working. But so when I say that it was an event, I mean we didn't have comic book movies like this very often. So Superman is a huge deal because we hadn't tried anything like this, and we didn't expect the mainstream to really go for a big budget huge blockbuster. And back then, I don't think we even really thought of them as blockbusters exactly, but that was an epic. That was like the Ben-Hur of superhero things, and we kind of started with that as far as mainstream big budget, using kind of A-list tier talent. And then you get to Batman 89 in the late 80s into the 90s, and it happens again. And part of the reason that was such a big deal was because it didn't seem, first of all, it didn't seem likely that it would ever happen with that character, but I think people embraced it because we just didn't have these serious superhero and comic book movies. And then that becomes the blueprint for the 90s. And then you get to the 2000s, and even though you had X-Men before this, and arguably that might have had some little bit of influence on this, they come out kind of right next to each other. I guess 2000 and then 2002. So like that had been out a couple of years. I don't know that Raimi could have even really looked at that or was looking at it very closely when he was making this. But there are some similarities that you could draw between the two. That's not the comparison contrast exercise I'm going to do, but just in the kind of pseudo realism of it. Although that was moving further away from comic book to some degree, where it was kind of, I don't want to say afraid of the source material, but it clearly was trying harder to be taken seriously. And Raimi weirdly makes a movie that is really accessible at the same time as it says, we're going to be unabashed about this. It's a comic book thing. You're either going to accept it or you're not. And I think walks a really good line, finds a really good balance between realism and the heightened comic book stuff. But each of those decades has one of these movies that informs and creates the blueprint for everything that's going to come after it. So you do have a lot of stuff in the 2000s that is very different from Spider-Man, but it is the blueprint for what we think of as the superhero movie formula, and it's massively influenced by both Superman and Batman, and arguably, in my mind, it's a blend of both of those. If you're wondering what I think is the movie that has the blueprint for the 2010s, I don't think that's as cut and dry, and maybe we'll talk about this in another video down the road, but I think it's a combination of Avengers and Dark Knight. And Dark Knight, of course, is 2008. Iron Man is also 2008, but I think Avengers before Iron Man, maybe, for the rest of the decade, partly because we just couldn't get away from teen movies and stuff like that. Also, we haven't had a lot of time away from it, so the longer we go, the easier it'll be to look back at that decade and say, what was the blueprint? What were really the influences? I took a history class in college with a professor who said he doesn't really like to talk about things in terms of history until it's been history for 25 years. And that's a lot of the whole of the superhero movies that we talk about here. It's been 25 years, and so it's impossible to do that. And this isn't just a history show, of course, but I couldn't begin to tell you what it's going to be yet for this decade because we're only 2 years in. But will it be No Way Home in some way, in doing a lot of gimmicky multiverse type stuff and being a lot about nostalgia, or is it gonna be maybe The Batman? I kind of don't see that, even though I think that movie's wonderful and it did pretty well. But I don't know, it's really hard to say. But anyway, so I want to go through some of the similarities, and some of them will be real broad things and some of the more specific and just kind of fun things that I found between Batman 89 and Superman, because I think Spider-Man, like I said, is a perfect blend between those movies. By the way, I didn't say this earlier, but if you're watching right now live, thanks so much for being here. And I'm not looking at comments at the moment. I always like to kind of give you a lot of my review and notes before I go to the comments. I am going to do what I did last week, where I'm going to do one part and then talk to you guys and then do a second part. I hadn't planned on doing that, but I really enjoyed that structure last week, and I think I'm going to run with it, at least for this week, and see what happens. This show is very experimental right now, and we'll see what kind of a format we land on as we go along. But anyway, so I'm going to do some comparison contrast and go through those similarities. I say comparison contrast. I'm just going to talk about the similarities where there's a bunch of Batman and where there's a bunch of Superman. But before that, I want to talk about how Spider-Man as a character and as an idea is kind of both Batman and Superman, just as a character, not just in this movie, and how kind of poetic and just perfect it is that you had a movie that defined a decade with Superman, and then defined a decade with Batman, and then the next thing is just this perfect blend that in style and in character and in idea and theme, Stan Lee kind of married them, whether he was thinking to do it that way or not. So here are my here's my evidence for saying that. So, Spider-Man uses intimidation, but is also a public figure like Superman, and tries to inspire and comfort regular people, as opposed to just trying to intimidate the bad guys. And of course, more recently, we've had Batmans that are very concerned about the influence that they're having on others, and in being a good role model. But typically, your standard Batman's not as worried about that, and is totally fine with being an urban legend. Spider-Man is equally praised and vilified by the public. So Batman, most people not real sure about that guy. Superman, most people believe that he's on our side, or that he kind of walks on water. Spider-Man has superpowers like Superman, but he also uses gadgets like Batman. He lives in New York City, which is both the lighter and darker version of the cities that Batman and Superman have, because each of those is kind of a allegory, or just showing the darker or the lighter side of New York City. So like Metropolis is New York, and Gotham is also New York. New York is just New York, and Spider-Man explores both sides of that, the grittier side, and the more idealized, lighter side. And I think this movie does that too. Spider-Man has a tragic backstory like Batman, but one of his parents lives like Superman often has. Very often one of his parents dies, but the other one sticks around. Spider-Man is not than Batman, is a little bit more violent like Batman sometimes, but he's more hopeful than Batman like Superman. And like both of those characters, of course, doesn't kill, but he'll go a little bit farther often in the street level violence direction than a Superman. And finally, he is a tragic character like Batman just inherently, but he also wants a personal life, unlike Batman, and tries to have a family like a lot of versions of Superman. So a in a lot of ways, he's kind of both of those characters, at least in attitude and how he operates. So now, let's go through a lot of the Batman 89 that I found, and then the Superman that I found. I think this will be fun. So we have an opening titles that reminds me a little bit of 89. It's going in and out of webs instead of the bat symbol, and it doesn't pull out at the end to show you, a big reveal of something that you didn't know was there. It's clearly webs, but it's a little bit similar to that, and of course it has a theme by Danny Elfman, it doesn't sound exactly like that, but you can tell it's the same composer. It's so weird how this worked out, especially because there were so many different directors that were vying for this, and it's really weird that the director of Batman and the director of Spider-Man are both people who had worked with Danny Elfman before on movies with scores that sound almost identical. So this movie is made by, of course, Sam Raimi, the director of Darkman, which came out in 1990. Batman comes out in 89. Both have scores by Danny Elfman, both, again, really similar. And if I'm remembering this correctly, Sam Raimi, part of the reason he made Darkman is because he loved Batman and couldn't make a Batman, so he came up with Darkman. And that's an interesting movie. Of course, I've reviewed it before. It's, in a way, sort of like, and I never had this thought before until I watched this movie again, it's sort of like if a Norman Osborn type became a Batman, or became a vigilante, in that he's got a little bit of the Jekyll Hyde thing. He kind of turns into a monster, and that, again, had a score by Danny Elfman. So we have here's a really specific scene, okay? We have a hero who drops a bad guy from a high place, right? And the bad guy is dead or presumed dead, and then the police spot that hero and tell him to freeze or to stay where he is, and then he flees using his gadgets or his superpowers. Really specific scene that's almost exactly the same with both of those movies in a slightly different context, but they happen at a really similar place in the movie too. Of course, I'm talking about the Axis Chemical scene, and then where Spider-Man, or Peter before he's Spider-Man, I guess, accidentally drops the burglar out of the window, or I guess he trips over a piece of metal and he falls out the window. Neither of them meant for the bad guy to fall to his death, but that is what happened, ostensibly, in the case of the Joker. Norman Osborn lives in Wayne Manor from 89. They went and shot in the same interior for at least part of that mansion. There is a fight in a dark alley, with camera flashes and a really similar score. It's not as long in Spider-Man, and the context is very different. He doesn't have a Vicky Vale. He's taking his own pictures. He's got an automatic, shutter. We have a villain in both of these movies who gets a lot of creepy and funny screen time all on his own. We have a boardroom scene with the villain acting super ominous, and in one case, one of those people dies in that scene. I'm glad you're dead. And in the other case, they all die, but just a little bit later. We have a villain who dies at the end and is arguably responsible for his own death. I think maybe less so with 89, but they both kind of have that. Here's another really weirdly similar scene. And by the way, this isn't me saying that Sam Raimi just massively ripped off 89. I think some of this is coincidence. I think some of this was they weren't even thinking that. And there was apparently a little bit of argument on set about not getting too close to 89, particularly with the set I mentioned earlier that's the same as Wayne Manor. Apparently, I can't remember who it was, if it was the set designer, but somebody else working on the movie tried to forbid Raimi to shoot there because he didn't want too many direct comparisons to be drawn between the two movies, and he's like, nobody's going to know it's the same place, and I didn't know it was until, now that he said it. I guess it looks a little familiar, but I didn't know it until I listened to his commentary in preparation for this video. But we have a bad guy who attacks a huge city festival, of course, different times in the movie, and one's in daylight and one's at night. But a bad guy attacks a huge city festival filled with parade floats And there's a popular contemporary artist that provides the score for the scene, for at least part of the scene. With Prince, it's a lot more of it, and he's not actually there. And then in the case of Spider-Man, you had, I can't remember her name right off, but you had a popular artist who's, what was it? Oh, her name is on the tip of my tongue. I've almost got it. But she's actually there singing in the festival. You have a damsel in distress, that screams a lot and in exactly the same register. If you put Mary Jane and Vicky Vale's voices together screaming at the top of your lungs, I don't know their lungs. I don't know that you could tell the difference between them. You have a creepy villain scene with a newspaper. With Joker, it's a oop, oop, and then with Norman Osborn, it's when he learns that the Goblin personality has taken over and is revealing himself and has killed the Board. And with that wonderful scene, one of the best scenes in the movie, when he goes up to the full-length mirror and he pulls out the newspaper, and then Norman just looks at it like this. It's creepy and it has a newspaper. Oh, you have characters wearing black turtlenecks. It's not our hero in Spider-Man that does it, but Harry Osborn has a black turtleneck, and I think he's standing in the set of Wayne Manor. All the explosions in this movie look like 89 explosions to me. I know that's a weird one, but I always had that. So this is another very specific one, and this is the last one I'll mention about Batman. So you get toward the end of the movie, we're in the third act, and we got the sadistic choice, or we're just past that. And Mary Jane is dangling from the tram. She's holding on to a big piece of metal. And the Spider-Man says, I need you to climb down. Just like Batman tells Vicky Vale, see that thing on my belt. Yeah, that reminded me of that. Okay, here's some similarities to Richard Donner's Superman, and one or two of these will be Superman 2 things, but I think it's fair to bring that up because they were supposed to be the same movie. So we have hopeful, lighter, romanticized in New York sensibilities as opposed to the more German expressionistic kind of thing that you get with Gotham in Batman, the more kind of Blade Runner looking sort of city. This is an origin story. Batman is not, although it is an origin story for the villain, and it's that way like in Batman, and you don't get that in Superman. You get kind of an origin for Zod in a way, but Lex Luthor is just there while Superman has to catch up to him. You have a romance with a hero in costume, and that's almost a love triangle between your hero's persona and himself and the female love interest. You have that in Superman, of course. It feels timeless, despite, at least to some degree, like I said earlier, despite taking place in a particular time period. So Superman is very squarely set in the 70s, and you can tell, and there are even like cultural references, and it is dated. But when you go back and look at it now, I've always felt like, I don't know if I want to say period piece. I don't think you can make exactly that movie now. Like, it is the sensibilities of the time, but it has this timelessness to it, where I feel like you can still show it to anybody that has never seen a movie from the 70s, didn't grow up in the 70s, doesn't know anything about that period, and they won't be lost, and all the human stuff will still potentially resonate with them. I think this movie has that. You have a spectacular public debut of your hero, like with the World Unity Festival, like you do with the helicopter crash in Spider-Man. And related to that, you have your hero and love interest meeting on a roof after she gets saved the first time. You have a villain who is obsessed with besting the hero and did not create the hero. So you have that with Lex and with Green Goblin. You have you have the moment where the shirt opens to reveal the costume and logo, which is, of course, a direct homage to Superman. Some of these are things that, again, it just happens to have in common that it might be subconsciously influenced by and wasn't really thinking about. And some of them are just direct homages. There's, I think, more direct reference to Superman, actually, than there is Batman. I think, weirdly, even though some of the scenes are almost or at least the couple of scenes that I broke down earlier, feel almost verbatim. Again, I think that's coincidence. I don't think that was intentional. I think Elfman knew it though, because he scores those scenes really similarly in both. It's hard to know, but when he pulls the shirt open and you get the spider, it's just Superman. And honestly, I never cared for that. I thought that was too much of a direct reference. It was too obvious. It didn't seem like a thing that Spider-Man does. You know, he's just like, I'm Spider-Man, and it just doesn't seem like a Spider-Man thing to me. He can't save his uncle, just like Superman couldn't save his father. Of course, they're different situations, and that will influence them in different ways and make them become very different kinds of heroes. You have a struggle to decide how to use your superpowers for yourself or for the betterment of mankind, and dealing with the things that you can't change. And again, that's a little bit more Superman 2, but both of those movies have that. Batman wouldn't have that because he doesn't have superpowers. And you have a hero who has to sacrifice being with the girl he loves because he has a greater responsibility to the world. And again, that's Superman 2, and those are related things. I wanted to make a food metaphor real quick. I think this movie is Coke with sugar. Like, it's the original, it's not the definitive version. We have improved on it in a lot of ways, and you might not think you'd care to go back, but when you do, it's surprisingly refreshing. And that was the experience that I had with it this time around. I have to kind of remind myself, oh yeah, this is a fun movie. I like this movie. Like I said, I kind of had it in my head for a long time that we'd just gotten past this, and I'd kind of been there, done that, and I didn't really need this movie anymore. And more, I don't want to say it's my favorite Spider-Man movie, because story-wise and stuff, it certainly isn't, but I really miss when superhero movies could be like this, when there was something special about them because there weren't so many of them, and you didn't know if it would be successful or not. And you still don't always know, of course, but it's more impressive how confident and sure of itself this movie is when it has no idea how it's going to perform or if anybody is going to accept it. And Sam Raimi is just a really impressive director for that. Now I want to talk a little bit about some of the ways that I think this movie is superior to the reboots, to kind of harken back to the whole formula of my original rewind on this, when I was saying here are the things that a movie should take from this and not. Now that we've had a whole bunch of movies after this, and 2 reboots, and 2 Amazing Spider-Man movies, a whole trilogy now of MCU movies, and even Into the Spider-Verse, because going back to this, I found it surprisingly easy to forget about everything that came after this. And I think that's part of why I enjoyed it so much more this time around. Like, I really put myself back in 2002 and was able to compartmentalize and go, we've only had a few superhero movies total at this point, and a lot of them are obscure, and we're just kind of ripping off the last big thing we had. And yes, this movie does establish, like I said, the superhero origin formula, and way too many movies went back and just kind of used this as a cookie-cutter blueprint and kept, like Fantastic Four, and kept just repeating this. And you could say in some ways superhero movies were worse for this movie, but we wouldn't have gotten a lot of them without it. And there's this kind of growing pains period that you have to go through when you have something new like this, and figuring out what lessons to take from it, right? You had that with Batman. You had too many movies in the 90s that just wanted to be Batman 89 again. You had things that had no business. Thank you for the super chat, Matthew. I'll look at that in a little bit. And if anybody else wants to put in specific questions or thoughts via super chat, feel free to, and don't worry, we'll get to it after a little bit. But I've got some analysis to do first. Anyway, but I just wanted to, where was I going? I got distracted by that. But anyway, let's go ahead and just get into how. I know what I was going to say. So you had things in the '90s that had no business going to Batman '89, like the Flash TV pilot. It was just, let's be Batman, but it's the Flash. That's the character that we have the rights to, or we're allowed to make right now. And so that kind of thing did happen with Spider-Man, and eventually we kind of grew out of it. Like, superhero movies did get story-wise more sophisticated than this when you got to Iron Man and Dark Knight, but I guess the big point I'm making is there's room for both, and I really miss it. Like, superhero movies got either, at a point, a lot of them got really kind of pretentious and were kind of protesting too much and making a big deal out of, yeah, we're based on a comic book, but don't worry, it's so serious and it's really about something. And the best of them would just be about something, you know, like a Winter Soldier or like a X2 or something. And then, which I guess is just the year after this, you know, X-Men Days of Future Past. And then you'd have other movies that were just kind of gimmicky and are like, yeah, we're a silly superhero movie, and we're just like Spider-Man, and I'm tugging at your heartstrings, and I'm like, I've been here and seen this before, and there's nothing new on the table, and it's not actually resonating. And the perspective there's a historical perspective I feel like I have to have going back to this, where for this time, this was doing what Iron Man did and what Dark Knight did. It's not just a silly action movie. It might feel that way now, in exactly the same way as 89 feels kind of quaint now and not as dark and serious and sophisticated as a lot of people were saying it was back then, because we have everything that came after it to compare it to. And again, you don't know where you are in history as it's happening. And so when you go back to this and you can put your mind where we were in 2002, especially if you're you know, middle-aged and getting older like me, you can go back and go, oh yeah, that's right, it was unusual to have so many art house people involved in making a movie like this, and it really is kind of about something, and it's maybe not as nuanced and layered, and it's maybe not as... It's more coherent than something like Batman 89, certainly. I know it's happening all the way through. The story more or less makes sense, but it's not a, like, literary piece in the same way as some of the more recent superhero movies that we have, like the Batman, that really transcend the comic book thing. But for the time, it was that, and I think that's an important thing to note. But anyway, so here are some ways that I think that this movie, still 20 years later, is superior to some of the things that have come after it. The spider sense is spoken at the very beginning and set up in a field trip. That comes up right away. I kind of like how the tour guide at in the field trip at Oscorp is breaking down, it's Oscorp in Amazing Spider-Man, isn't it? Was this a museum? I think it is. But you have a lady who's kind of breaking down what all of Peter Parker's powers are going to be. It does a really good job of giving you that exposition and explaining all the Spider-Man stuff for a person that doesn't know anything about this character without making an audience that is familiar bored. That's another thing that it has in common with Richard Donner's Superman, is it's a wonderful introduction to this character if you don't know anything about it. But anyway, the MCU has been too good for that, just like with the not even mentioning Uncle Ben thing, where it's like the things that you're too familiar with, we have to make fun of and never bring up, and I've never understood that with Spider-Sense. I get the argument from their side on the Uncle Ben thing. I don't agree with it. I think it's obnoxious. But with Spider-Sense, the whole Peter Tingle thing, it's not funny. I'm sick of it. I don't know why we didn't move on from it immediately after that second movie, or why we couldn't even get the Spider-Sense in that movie. I miss stuff like this that kind of directly translates some of the comic stuff. As I always say, it's not that it can't be different from the comics. It's not that it's bad if it's not exactly perfectly what we had in comic books. But there are some things where will avoid things for no good reason. It's kind of that CW thing with Smallville and Arrow and a lot of their shows, where we have to be different for the sake of being different, as opposed to we have a cool idea all our own. I don't understand why we avoided that. It's not built on a series of conveniences, and it's not a convoluted mystery like Amazing Spider-Man or even Spider-Man 3. And I'm mostly comparing this to the other franchises as opposed to its own sequels. But even 3 had that problem, which is a lot of why I don't like that movie. The suit, in some ways, has never been beaten. It is directly translated from the comics, except for the raised webbing, which I always thought looked super cool. When I was a kid, I loved that change. I thought for live action, it made perfect sense, and it really pops on the screen. I like some of the other suits. I really like the red and black one from Far From Home. And I like that they do the webbed armpits and stuff in those movies. But I don't think it's better. This is the best balance, maybe, of sympathetic and evil for a Spider-Man villain. Don't get me wrong, Green Goblin is not a super complex character, and Norman Osborn, certainly in other things, especially comics, has been a more complex, more interesting character before, but I like that the movie is able to have a villain. It has its cake and eats it too, where it has a villain that is straight up evil. But the character that gets compromised, who has his mind taken over by an evil personality, is not just straight up evil in the first place. He's a deeply flawed guy. He's not even... I mean, he comes off kind of likable, but if you read between the lines, you realize all the mistakes he's making in his life, and that he's the anti-Uncle Ben, and we'll get to that here in a little bit, but he's the grown-up who never figured out the responsibility lesson and kind of lives in his own little world and blames other people for the problems that are going on in his life that are actually... that he's actually the one to be blamed for, that he's got a responsibility for, and then he pays for that with the Goblin persona, and I like that he doesn't have to be just straight up sympathetic, that you can have both. He comes from a place and you understand where he comes from, at least to some degree. I mean, I don't know what his parentage was and why he has some of the insecurities he seems to have, but you can make a couple of assumptions with that, I think. Also, all 3 Raimi movies have this to some degree, and I had never really thought of this before, and then you'll go back and find a really old video of mine where I bring up this point, but I don't remember having this thought, where Doc Ock, because people have always talked about him as one of the first, if not the first, like really, maybe besides like Magneto, really sympathetic superhero villains that we've had, and he still certainly deserves that, and yet he's kind of Norman Osborn all over again if Norman was just a better guy in the first place, because he doesn't have a mental condition that gets created, of course, because he's able to snap himself out of it once he gets the inhibitor chip back. But it is kind of weird that we did that 3 times, right? Like, Norman Osborn is kind of possessed, and with another personality that takes over, and the same thing with the arms and Doc Ock in the second movie, and then same thing with Venom and Eddie Brock in the third movie. It is maybe the best paced of all the Spider-Man movies, or at least it felt that way as I was watching it. It probably has the best musical theme. I know people love that theme, and for good reason. Elfman really tears it up with that. It is clearly in love with the source material, and Stan Lee's run the most, and that's infectious. In some ways, it's the most self-assured, which is impressive because it's the first, and it is probably the best Ant-Man. So, let's get into some story analysis, shall we? Why don't I go ahead and read these Super Chats first, actually, before we do that, because I still have quite a few notes to go through. Matthew Mertens, $9.99. Super Chat, it can be rough around the edges, but I prefer 1 over 2 because Osborn's villain arc is more believable than Doc Ock's, and the film's humor feels more natural. I agree with that. Plus, the overall pacing flows better, in my opinion, and I just suggested the same, actually. I think it is maybe the best paced of the Spider-Man movies. I am, with this watch anyway, I say this watch, I watched this 3 different times for this video. I don't always do it that many times, but I found 2 different commentaries that I wanted to watch, and then of course I watched the movie once, totally unfettered. But I think I'm in a place where, at least right now, I'm feeling like I appreciate the first movie over the second. I never thought I would have that. Spider-Man 2 is really high on my ranked list, and it's going to be weird when we go look at that, because I don't know where this movie is going to move, or if it's going to move, but I almost want to, at some point, redo Spider-Man 2, or I shouldn't say redo, but review it again, just to have an excuse to move that, because I think it's too high. But yeah, I think just this as a singular piece is in a lot of ways stronger than the second movie. A lot of that is relationship stuff, certainly. Matthew Mertens again, 499 Super Chat. Thanks, buddy. Also, when Peter says, I have a father, his name was Ben Parker, always makes me cry. One of the most powerful moments I've seen in an origin story. And yeah, it hit me differently than it had before, too. And again, I'm not 100% sure why I had such a dramatically different viewing these last couple times looking at this, but there's something, I don't want to say we've completely lost in all of superhero movies, but there's a rare quality that this has. It's hard to fully put my finger on. Okay, let's go through themes. You know what some of these are, clearly. Power and responsibility. Nobody's shocked to hear that come up. It's only mentioned in the movie 3 different times, and yeah, the with great power comes great responsibility line is kind of in your face, and we have to spell out the moral, and I give it a pass to some degree because Stan Lee did that as well, and it feels a little bit weird that, and of course we've had other movies that don't do this now, but it would have felt weird then probably to not have exactly that phrase come out. In the context of the movie, it is a little bit odd. It's hard to shoehorn it in, it's hard to work it in, and that's where Raimi is, and of course he didn't write the script, but Raimi is working really hard to find that realism versus comic booky kind of balance. So you have a movie that has kind of a surprising amount of violence and grit to it, that I think Sam Raimi does a really impressive job bringing that to it, but not making it a straight-up horror movie, and it feels like it warrants it whenever he goes there. It doesn't feel gratuitous. It just feels like he's playing to his strengths and finding places where it makes sense to give it that. And some of the kind of pathos and gravitas in the movie, I think, it comes from that, where you go, okay, this is a comic book world. This doesn't, even though it is New York City, it's an idealized looking New York City. It doesn't read exactly like real life, but this is a world where people can get hurt, and it's visceral, and the Peter Parker luck thing really plays because you have to go through some really difficult things along with him, and so I think it's smart that it actually goes to those places. But because of that, some of the cornier stuff, it's hard to decide if it really fully works. And I like some of the cheesy cornball stuff in this movie. I think Spider-Man 2 takes it too far. But I think Peter Parker, particularly, I guess I'll make this point now, as a character, the way he's raised, it makes sense that he would have that sensibility. So it doesn't read just like the world is cheesy. It's like this character, he says tally-ho and stuff. He was raised in a home as if it was still the 1950s. To some degree, and you notice there's not a lot of technology in the home that's beyond that. They have a very small TV. He's not playing PlayStation or anything, and it's kind of fun that you have that take on it while you still have a Peter Parker who maybe doesn't go far enough in the science direction, at least in this first movie, and in inventing and stuff, but you do have a Peter Parker who's interested in technology, and maybe, I just thought of this, but maybe some of that comes from living in a home that feels decades further back, and so he has this interest, but he also kind of appreciates the way he was raised. So I've never been sure if I totally buy where with great power comes great responsibility comes in context. If I'm Uncle Ben, I would be thinking, or if I'm Peter, I would be thinking, like, what is the power you think I have, you know? And maybe it's weird in the comics to some degree too, but like, I get that that's the moral, that's the mission statement, but when you say, you know, with great, it just seems a little dramatic, right? It's like, with any power comes responsibility is kind of really the point at the end of the day. But do I think that it should have been, you know, not said? No, not really. I mean, I'm conflicted about it. Anyway, let's get into more of the themes of the movie. Bullying and how it influences what we want and how we try to get it. I will break this down here in a little bit, but I think each of our three main teenage characters have bullies in their own life in various ways, and they all respond to it in, I think, really believable and realistic ways based on how they were raised, and their backgrounds really inform their personalities and how they cope with those situations. Coming of age, obviously, for all three of our teenage characters, but especially, of course, Peter Parker. Fathers and sons, positive and negative paternal role models, societal pressures to do whatever you have to succeed. This was a thing I'd really never picked up on before, and it's subtle and the whole movie's not about it, but the performance enhancer thing is interesting, right? It's steroids. It's like Norman Osborn thinks that to succeed, he's got these pressures from a government general to make these human trials work for the performance enhancers for the Green Goblin suit. And in his mind, the only way to make that happen is to prematurely put somebody on steroids, essentially. And even if they worked perfectly, that's still more or less what it is. It's like that idea, that kind of, I mean, I look at it as kind of a peer pressure thing, which is interesting because you're in a movie about teenagers who are kind of judging each other. And I don't know that there's a whole lot of like actual peer pressure in the movie, but it's interesting that that's there in a movie about kids being bullied in this age group. It's not a direct correlation, it ain't perfect, but I don't know, it's kind of interesting. It's not a thing that I'd thought of until this viewing, that you kind of have the same thing with the military and with the government, where in order to win the big game, in order to win the big war, we got to put everybody on steroids. Although, when they go with Quest instead of Norman Osborn, instead of Oscorp, I'm going to assume that they actually don't have to do that, because that's just kind of this really clunky looking primitive Iron Man suit where you get in what looks like a big rocket and you have a visor thing over your face and you just like fly really slowly. I don't understand how that's remotely as useful and sophisticated as the Goblin Glider for the military, and why they would go with that instead of, you'd think that they would just wait for Osborn to perfect his, but maybe it just comes down to that General hates that guy. Anyway, you've got love triangles, and you actually have a couple of different triangles. So you have a love triangle, I guess they're both, way love triangles, right? You have a romantic love triangle, and you have a family love triangle, and both are dealing with a jealous Harry Osborn. So he's the third point in each of these triangles. So you have Clark, pardon me, I'm going to talk about that in a second, but you have Peter and Harry and Mary Jane in the love triangle, and then you have, well, I guess Peter and Harry are both points on each of these triangles, and then you have, which is the reason their relationship falls apart. This is all comic book, by the way. Sometimes when you analyze these things, you're going to be talking about source material at the same time as you're talking about the actual movie, but they chose to put it here, and so I'm talking about how it works in the film. But then the parental familial triangle is Harry and Peter and Norman Osborn, and I just thought of this, but in each of these, you have a point on the triangle that's actually not as interested in being there as everybody else. So the triangle with Harry and Mary Jane and Peter Parker, like Mary Jane and Harry, or Mary Jane and Peter want to be together. Harry wants to be with Mary Jane. Mary Jane doesn't really care that much about Harry, and so it's not a typical love triangle in the sense that And by the way, I actually really like how that love triangle is handled, with as reasonable as Harry and Peter end up being. He'll be a lot less reasonable about the other triangle once we get into the next movie, but I'll leave it up to you about how you feel about that. We're not talking about that this time. But anyway, a typical love triangle would have a much more conflicted point on the triangle, usually with the girl who's like, I like both guys, I can't decide, and you don't have that with Mary Jane. And then with the other triangle, you have a Peter Parker that is kind of in the Mary Jane spot, where I guess Norman is somewhat of a father figure, somewhat of a role model. He does respect him. He's never going to be Uncle Ben, and he doesn't even try to let him replace him the way at the end of the movie Norman talks about that it's kind of happened. It really hasn't. But yeah, I had a kind of a Freudian slip and mentioned Clark Kent, and I'm talking about, of course, from Smallville, because it's kind of like the Luthers, except that it's like the Luthers and Kents in Smallville, except that Norman wants to have Peter in his family, whereas in that TV show, Lex wishes he was in Clark's family. And we really don't know how Harry feels about Ben. So it's a little different. The focus is different. Harry is not genuine like Peter with MJ, probably because he doesn't have a connection with his father or life. We don't really know what happened with his mother or what kind of relationship they had. Some of that background I would have liked to have maybe had, because some of this analysis would be easier to do, and there might be a little bit more depth to it if I knew more about Harry's background with his mother, if I knew more about Mary Jane's home life beyond just she has a father that gets drunk and yells a lot. That's really all we know. It seems like a really terrible situation, and those are parallels, right? Like, we have two really bad home life situations, one with Mary Jane, one with Harry, and we really don't know a ton about either of them. But I like how subtle it's handled to some degree, or rather, I wish I had those backgrounds, but I like how subtle the triangles are, where it doesn't feel, it's not forced drama. You don't have Harry and Peter at any point like screaming at each other for like, oh, you took my girl and whatever. I really like the scene where they actually talk about it, and when Harry says, look, I'm sorry, but like, you never made a move, and Peter agrees. He is not especially proactive when it comes to love. I think that's intentional. I think he's too not proactive enough, but I have a read on why, and just for my own taste, and I still think the story would be better served if he stepped up more than he does. I do think there are reasons for that, and I'll get to it in a little bit. I have a surprising amount to say about this movie, but I'm going to go ahead and do a super chat real quick. Thanks very much to Chewbacca's Lover, who put in a $10 super chat, and he says, this was my first superhero origin, never seen one before. And let me interject real quick and say, and I've said this on the channel before, but it was weird when I was in high school and this came out, because I remember sitting in the theater going, this is the superhero formula. This is these movies. They're all like this. And then I thought, what am I talking about? We haven't had very many. It's almost like I shot to the future or something and saw the future. And I was thinking, when we get more of these, they'll all be like this. And that's more or less kind of what happened. And I don't mean that I was a seer or something, but I'd read a lot of comics and seen a lot of superhero TV shows or cartoons and stuff. And I just looked at that and this, and I was like, oh, it's really kind of formulaic. And I don't want to begrudge it for that too much. I think the Green Goblin plot itself is really thin, and the third act comes about in a really kind of obvious way, and it's also formulaic as an action movie to some degree. So it's not like we'd never seen the formula before. We just haven't had a lot of comic book movies. Batman Rocks just put in a massive $50 super chat, and I can't tell you how much I appreciate that. So I'm going to go ahead and read that right now as well, and then I'll get back to my thoughts. He says, I feel like Peter in this movie is too much like Steve Rogers in the sense of him being a nice person to begin with. He's also too contemporary like Steve. I always preferred Peter being resentful to people besides Ben and May pre-Spider-Man. Yeah, I completely understand your reservations with that. I think there's a better middle ground than is found here. Where, yeah, I'm with you. I think they go too far in the other direction. It reads to me as almost out of character when he gets to the fateful moment where he decides not to stop the burglar. Because he just doesn't seem like that guy. I don't see any resentment in him. And there are a lot of things with, and this is the weakest stuff to me in the movie, there are a lot of things that I feel like probably worked fine on paper that aren't translated quite right through the performances. And in certain ways, Tobey McGuire and even Kirsten Dunst, who I really don't like after this, but I like some things she does here, I think in some ways they're perfect for these characters, and I think in some ways their acting is the problem. Not that it's bad, but just that their interpretation seems kind of off. And some of what you're talking about is probably in the script, and some of it is Tobey Maguire, where in the comics, and again, I'm not saying it's bad because it's not comics, but it does want to more directly translate this than I think it is. He is self-serving in the first place and way too cocky, and yes, he's bullied. That's the kind of the complexity of the character, where there's two sides to him from the beginning, where Tobey Maguire reads it like he's just overall sort of mousy and internalized and unsure of himself, and there are bits of that in that character if he goes up against the wrong people, but by and large, I always saw it in early Peter Parker as naive and wet behind the ears and just impulsive and immature, and he's gonna try things that he's not ready to try yet. So when he gets superpowers, he goes, oh yay, I can get rich with this, and I can use this for personal gain, and it never occurs to him to try to help anybody with those powers. And I feel like you need a sense that there's something in him in the first place that that might respond to the wrestling manager the way he responds, but if you're not careful, you make him really unsympathetic and unlikable from the very beginning. I guess my point is, he's supposed to be immature, and it seems like instead of immature, the compromise that was made was, in order to make him more likable, we make him really unsure of himself, and that's the difference. And to some degree, most teenagers are going to be unsure of themselves, at least subconsciously, but you know, I remember, not to get too personal, but I remember I went through a period of both of these things, where like one period of I'm really unsure of the world and who I want to be, and then a period where I go, I've got it all figured out, and I'm going to attack life head on. And maybe the idea is that he turns into that when he gets his powers in the first place, and now that he's got powers, he can be cocky because he feels invincible. I don't read enough of that from it, and maybe it would have been enough just to have him be a little bit less mopey when he deals with Mary Jane, and a little bit quicker in responding to things. But yeah, I totally see your reservation, and I share some of it, certainly. Chewbacca's Lover, $10 super chat. As a kid, I thought the Goblin costume looked cool. It's hard not to think of it as cool, even though it's not, because of how it made me feel. Yeah, it is kind of silly, it is hokey. Something I didn't know that I read about in preparation for this is that the notches on the sides of it were intentionally put there to try to make it look like a watch band, like a digital watch band, like the clasps, you know, on like a metal watch band. I don't know why that was thought of as like a cool anatomical thing to put in that suit, but that's what was done. I've got a question a little bit later about the suit, so I won't talk any more about that right now. But Chewbacca's Lover says, I didn't finish reading his first $10 super chat. You're right, I interjected and then I forgot to finish it. My apologies. This is my first superhero origin, never seen one before. Stuff like him making the costume and how he got his powers blew my mind at 7. I had never considered this before, that he was always Spider-Man. Yeah, there was a novelty to that I think is difficult to appreciate as much now, because we're just kind of used to it. We think of it as a trope. It's hard not to look at your watch and say, okay, move on. Like, we've seen this 1,000 times. I like Shazam, but that movie has that and it's funny, but you have to go through the montage of, or the collection of scenes of the character messing around with his powers, figuring out what he can get away with. And so the problem is just, there are a lot of superheroes, and a lot of them have commonalities, and I don't want to say you've seen one, you've seen them all, but there are going to be a lot of similarities. That the more of these movies we make, the more of those kinds of things you're going to have to sit through if you do Origin, and that's why I think we should be a little bit more careful in picking and choosing which ones really require an origin and which ones don't. And I think this movie, at one time, I'm going to contradict things I've said in videos before. I mean, at one time, I thought that Spider-Man was closer to that Fantastic Four thing of the origin is just there to get the ball rolling. I'm not, you can make anything work, you just have to make it work. I'm not saying that you can't have a 2-hour Fantastic Four movie that is an origin and have me riveted by it and make me go, there really was a story there, but you kind of have to come up with a lot of it whole cloth, because the story itself really is just an excuse for those characters to get powers at the end. Like, that's all it is. And Spider-Man being the first big superhero origin past Superman, there's a story here from the beginning. It's arguable whether or not it warrants a 2-hour runtime, but you kind of get the origin in the first hour, and then, you know, the whole thing is one story, but we kind of wrap up Green Goblin's beginning, middle, and end in it in order to make it a whole tale that wouldn't just be a short film. But I mean, the coming-of-age story is Amazing Fantasy 15. I mean, the original, or I'm sorry, I guess is that where the origin's told? I can't remember now if it's that or if it's in Amazing #1. I'm rusty, it's been a long time. But when Stan Lee first gives us that origin, it's short, but it is a beginning, middle, and end. Peter Parker, and it does read like, here's the background for this character, but there's a complete story there. It is literary. It is a character who wants something and has an opportunity for change and takes it, and then at the end, he has grown up some. One of the things that's wonderful about Stan Lee's comics, of course, is that he doesn't completely magically fully grow up there. He still has a lot of learning to do. And the movies, to their credit, attempted to do that as well, certainly. But yeah, I'm with you. It was, I can especially see how, being a kid, it would have been a big deal to see him get his powers, and that kind of laundry list of figuring out all the things he can do and how it would feel to actually have that happen to you. Let me go ahead and get back to my planned analysis here. So, like I said, I think that this story is about bullies and about how characters to respond to them, and it's all about the way our characters deal with injustice and deal with irresponsibility, and there's kind of what's the word I'm looking for? If you respond to irresponsibility with irresponsibility, the universe punishes you for it. And certainly, like all good Spider-Man stories, sometimes when you do the right thing, you also have to pay for it, because actions and consequences kind of fickle. You never know how what you do is going to affect things in other people. But by and large, in this movie anyway, you are to some degree rewarded if you're responsible, or at least things work out more or less okay, and you are punished for handling irresponsibility with irresponsibility in curiously related or poetic ways. And so we'll get into that. So Peter has a number of different bullies, and between his two personas. So Peter Parker has Flash Thompson and J. Jonah Jameson to some degree, and the Green Goblin when he's in his Spider-Man costume. He usually responds passively or indirectly. And there's like a measured response from the universe that deals with his kind of passively handling things in an indirect way. So he almost always hurts people he cares about in an indirect fashion. So he is irresponsible in choosing not to do something, and then something bad happens to somebody he cares about in an indirect way as opposed to affecting him directly. And even though I'm saying the universe, interestingly, sometimes in real life, this can be how this happens as well. So he chooses in the hallway not to deal with the burglar because he doesn't like how he was treated by the wrestling manager, and he feels, he gets all full of himself, and he feels vindicated, and he's kind of had his revenge, his justice. And then, of course, Uncle Ben dies, and that's when he starts realizing that he needs to act more responsibly, and he needs to use his power in a responsible way. But as Spider-Man, interestingly, that's kind of his calling card. That's kind of how he handles stuff. Not by not doing anything necessarily, but by being more reactionary and more passive in, I don't want to say exactly a Power Rangers Zordon kind of way, but it's somewhat similar to that, where he will... for instance, when you get to the end of the movie, he almost goes full tilt, hog wild, crazy on Norman Osborn, and then he finally stops. And when he kind of pulls himself together, he dodges the Goblin glider when it comes toward him, and that ends up killing the Goblin. And so Peter always handles things by getting out of the way. He handles things in a more indirect fashion. And so what he does when he does the wrong thing, when people have to pay for stuff, it's always somebody else. The Green Goblin, Norman Osborn, has the opposite thing, where he always hurts himself, and in a very direct kind of way. And this is a thing I hadn't thought about before either. I think it's really interesting that Peter, as a kid who has not yet figured out the responsibility lesson, and everybody has to figure that out, maybe at different times in our lives, different ages, but Peter's a teenager, and he has to get his power and then learn how to use it responsibly. And Norman Osborn is an adult and already doesn't understand this. And of course, we're talking about two kinds of power, right? But he uses his regular human power of he was successful and he has a lot of money to give himself power. And so Peter gets power, has to be responsible. Norman is irresponsible and then gets power, and then it's too late. And that's not a thing I thought about before. I think it's really interesting how those mirror each other. The Green Goblin is a mirror for Spider-Man in that he does the exact opposite of Spider-Man. He's there to amass as much power as he can, and he's not going to use it responsibly. Spider-Man is only there to help other people at the point where he's decided that that's what the costume is going to represent. He's past the wrestling thing. And it's interesting that I'm looking at my notes real quick because I have lost my train of thought a little bit. I'll get to that here in a minute. But let's look at some of the other characters that have their own bullies. So, because I've gotten a little bit ahead of myself. So you have your 3 teenage characters, and each of them has bullies and handles them differently. So Peter handles his in a very passive way, at least initially. Mary Jane has the bullies of her father and her boss at the diner, and she responds by rebelliously going out with the wrong kinds of guys and hanging out with bullies or with guys that have money. And by the way, some of this is kind of typical. I'm not saying the movie is genius for some of these things, but I'm just breaking down what it is that it's doing. It's a little bit typical in that you do have this a lot with high school girls or college girls in stories who go out with the bad boy or who are abused at home. We don't know how abusive the father is. We just know that he screams a lot and he's a jerk face and he drinks too much. Calls her worthless and all of that. And sometimes, or very often, you'll have these kind of stereotypical female characters that will go out with their awful fathers. So they think they're trying to get apart from that, where they're actually just kind of looking for more of it, and it ends up being kind of a self-destructive thing. And she gets more and more away from that as the movie goes along, and her arc is about dropping that whole thing and trying to be with someone who is actually good for her and healthy for her. And the tragedy is he is trying to protect her by the end, so he can't be with her, and she needs that for her own emotional support and health. And he's trying to keep her healthy so he won't date her. That's supposed to be the tragedy of the ending, of course. And I also think that part of the reason she wants to be an actress is maybe to try to escape into a fantasy world. And then Harry Osborn's bully is his father, and he hurts himself like his father does, but not physically, and not in the same mental kind of way. That will happen later, but he hurts himself emotionally in trying to gain his father's approval and become successful, and that's why he dates Mary Jane. I like the way that these characters all intertwine with this. Eventually, his jealousy will hurt everyone he cares about directly, and he'll be a foil for Peter in the later movies. And it's not the most successful thing the way that's handled, but that's supposed to be the idea, is that Norman Osborn, Green Goblin, in the way I mentioned earlier, is a foil for Spider-Man, but Norman Osborn is a foil for Uncle Ben, and Harry Osborn will become the foil for Peter Parker down the line. So those kids all have actual bullies. In Norman's mind, he does too. He doesn't take responsibility for anything in his own personal life. So to him, the bully is the military or that one general, in his own mind. And so he blames that guy and not himself for his problems. And that's what makes him irresponsible. Keep in mind that his technology wasn't ready. And if the government had gone ahead with it, he would be in way worse shape. Like, his company probably would have been shut down. So it wasn't anything like a good idea to, on the general's part, to go with the trials they had already, because they had one that didn't work out, and they hadn't done any human trials at all. And so the idea that, and it's weird because it plays in the movie like that general just wants to get back at Norman. For whatever reason, I don't fully understand what's going on with that guy, but he hates Norman Osborn. At the same time, he's actually doing his job. Like, whatever his motivation is, he's right that they shouldn't go forward with that yet, and Osborn's not thinking about anybody else. He's just thinking about himself, like Peter will in the hallway later. And so he acts irresponsibly by doing, a horrible thing to himself. But he's not a monster in the first place, and that's what I was talking about earlier. He's really misguided, he doesn't see the world as it is, but it's not like he doesn't care about his son at all. You have the thing, of course, with Peter Parker, where he wishes that his son was more like Peter, and he wishes Peter could be his surrogate son, but he, you have the line at the beginning with Harry, like he wants to adopt you. There is certainly some truth to that, but I think that there is an attempt to make him a little bit more likable even than he is in the comics, where he is looking out for his son sometimes. And I don't think if he didn't care about his son at all, he would do the weekly inspections, like at his apartment. And I don't think it's just because Peter's there. It might be, but I really don't read it that way. And yeah, maybe he's controlling, and maybe he does that because he likes intimidating his son or something. But it doesn't read that way. It reads like he's just disappointed with his kid, and he wishes that it could be different. And he's not handling it right, certainly. But again, I don't think he's a straight up monster. He seems like a guy who wants to do the right thing but can't see what it is. And then, of course, he becomes Spider-Man's bully. So he thinks he's bullied, but he's actually a bully in his own right. And then let's go ahead and look at the Norman Osborn as a father figure versus Uncle Ben, because he's really the foil for that character. So Ben has nothing and everything. Family is all that matters to him. So he is not especially wealthy, of course, and then he loses his job, and now he's in really a bad place. He leaves his son when he dies with a life philosophy that makes him better, and the knowledge that he loved him and believed in him, and Spider-Man becomes his legacy. Norman Osborn, by contrast, has everything and nothing. He has all the money in the world, but he doesn't care enough about his family, and he doesn't appreciate what he has. He's kind of entitled in that way. He cares more about legacy and reputation than anything else. Sacrifice, this is what I was going to say earlier. Now I remember my point. Sacrifice is about success and personal gain, not sacrifice for the greater good. There's a thing with Norman Osborn, and again, I don't know that I never really articulated this before, where he has the wrong kind of self-sacrifice, this really weird, selfish kind. It's a perversion of what Spider-Man has to learn, and he starts from it, which is the reason that he's at the point of no return 10 minutes in the movie. There's no chance for this guy because of what he gives up. He gives up his mind. He essentially has internally the kind of break that, and I'm going to go to Star Trek again, that Captain Kirk has in the early original series episode, The Enemy Within, where there's a good Kirk and an evil Kirk. And you have that with Norman Osborn. You have the good Osborn and the evil Osborn, and the evil Osborn has all the confidence and the self-assuredness, and he gets things done, but at what twisty cost. And the good Osborn wants to do the right thing, but he doesn't have any wherewithal, but that's all within him. And that's the psychological break he has. So I think it's really interesting that he starts from self-sacrifice, or what he sees as self-sacrifice. I have to hurt myself in order to get what I want with the government contract. Which is, again, is kind of ludicrous that he thinks that that's going to... What's going to happen? Like, even if that trial was successful, does he think he would take it to that general and go, okay, I did it to myself, and it worked out, so let's move forward now. The general would be like, especially because he's got it out for him anyway, he'd be like, no, you're a crazy person. We need, like, real regular human trials. You've gone off the deep end, and he would use that as an excuse to shut him down, I would think. That is desperation. And then, of course, Spider-Man has, Green Goblin tries to be the dark, perverse father figure for Spider-Man. Not because he cares about Spider-Man, but because he wants to use him to his own ends, which are apparently being powerful and being superior and better than anyone else in the city. I don't totally know what's going on there. So that's the whole thing about power and responsibility with Norman. I had some more notes on that, but I think I'll go ahead and move on. Let me check and make sure that we don't have any more super chats I haven't read yet. Yeah, there's a couple other things here. Chewbacca's Lover, $5 super chat. To show you how much of a dumb kid I was, I thought because the film was PG-13, it could end with Goblin killing him. That climax was intense at 7. Yeah, but I could see that as a kid because that scene is so rough that you might think, well, was he really going to die here? I could see as a kid you being naive enough to think that that might happen. Obviously, it wouldn't because it's got to be a franchise. I mean, heck, I was naive like that with John Wick. I really thought originally, and I've done a rewind on that movie, that story was served better, and I'm not saying that this is, that'd be a crazy tragic thing, right? Where it's like, I've learned the power responsibility lesson. I am ready to be the hero and perpetually make the self-sec. I'm dead. I'm dead now. That just goes to show you, kids, if you have superpowers and somebody turns a gun on you in a hallway, or has a, I guess doesn't turn a gun on you, but has a gun in a hallway and just robs somebody, jump them immediately. Always do that. That's good advice, kids. We'll get to that in a little bit. Bob the Hun, another $5 super chat. Thanks so very much. Why do you think the go-to rating for superhero films is PG-13 over PG? Great question. Like 90% of them are PG-13. Is it 89? Edgy, but still family-friendly? Yeah, I think it's trying to be accessible. I think it's trying to make everybody happy, for better or worse, right? And also, I think it's because so it's to say we have some adult themes in our movie. It's going to be about some things. It's not just kiddie fare. You're not just going to see people running around in costumes, and it's not just a comedy. It's not just hilarity. There will be fun to be had for both sides. I think. Both sides for adults and kids. I think some of it is the filmmakers themselves. Anybody, not that everybody that makes a comic book movie likes comic books, but anybody that was a comic person in the 80s and beyond, and that's a lot of these directors even now, we're looking at Frank Miller and Eastman and Laird and Morrison and Frank Miller. Did I say Frank Miller? And Alan Moore, I meant to say, et cetera, et cetera. And comics weren't just for kids. And a lot of their sensibilities in wanting to translate some of this stuff, even if they're going back to 60s comics, they're still going to want a little bit of that grit because to them, that's what comics are. And you know, at some point comics stopped being just for kids because you had enough generations that were reading that stuff. So I think some of it is just the interest of the people making the stuff in the first place. And then finally, I think it's just the necessary amount of violence that has to be in these, where PG and PG-13 is so tricky, and maybe even more so now, really, where if you have a particular amount of violence, you're going to get to PG-13, and it's easier to, as a director, I think, or as producers, to go, these are the things we have to do to keep it from becoming R. I think it's a lot harder to say, here are the things that we have to do to make sure it stays PG versus PG-13. I think it's so arbitrary. Like, how many direct punches in the face, how many times can you say particular words, but again, especially with the violence. PG-13, you're not going to have any kind of blood whatsoever. Some things just warrant it to be remotely realistic, where it's like, it's not gross, it's like gratuitous, it's just, somebody got punched in the mouth, he's got a little bit of blood there. That's going to warrant a PG-13. So I think it's a lot easier to straddle the fence between, or to make sure that you don't go all the way to R, than it is to make sure you don't go all the way to PG-13. But that's a cool question, and I spent too long answering it. Let's talk just real briefly about now the relationships between Peter and MJ and Harry and MJ. Mary Jane, to finish up what we were talking about with the whole bully idea, because this is related. So Peter and Mary Jane get together because, or they don't get together, but they both want to eventually, because they're always really supportive of each other. Like, you can tell how much they really care about what happens to the other one. And but it doesn't really work out for obvious reasons by the end, because Peter Parker is afraid of what might happen to her. That becomes a real typical trope, and I'll mention that again a little bit later. But I feel like she keeps giving him a chance to step up the entire movie, waiting for him to make a move, and that's part of where I'm saying that he's not as proactive as I'd like to see him be, even when the whole idea is he responds to things indirectly or passively. So they have some commonalities. They're not exactly Clark Kent and Lana Lang from Smallville, where I have no idea why these people like each other. I do feel that way watching this movie, where I don't totally get... By the end of the movie, I think I understand why she's enamored with him. A lot of it has to do with how mature he's apparently gotten. And I think with just how much he truly cares about her. Like, compare him to Harry Osborn, and here's a person that really wants the best for her, isn't just using her as like a trophy or as a status symbol like Harry Osborn does. But they both grew up on the same street, which is a thing I don't love, but that's what this movie did. They are in the same kind of social class. That's a thing that's going to get in the way with her and Harry Osborn. Again, they both get bullied in different ways. They both want different things until the end. She needs, like I said earlier, public approval to make up for her lack of approval at home. She actually wants what Norman Osborn wants, which is really interesting. Status, reputation, relevance. Peter only needs to be relevant to her because he already has all those things at home. So that's the disconnect. That's where they are not the same. I find myself wondering why he's so into her, but it does actually make sense on paper because they fill in each other's gaps. Again, there's something about their performances together that's not quite working for me. Like, I've never thought that they have quite the right spark, the chemistry that Raimi thinks that they do. And Harry and Mary Jane, of course, by contrast, have a relationship of status and convenience. Mary Jane's not into him, spurns his advances, and he doesn't stick up for her with his father in the Thanksgiving scene because he wants his father's acceptance too much. So he's not there for the right reasons, doesn't actually care about her as much as he thinks he does. I don't mean not at all, but not as much as he thinks he does. Their commonalities are they both have bad home lives, parents who don't appreciate or believe in them. They should really understand each other, you'd think, better than they do because they both had really crappy home lives. But sometimes it's not just opposites attract. Sometimes somebody that has that kind of background needs to see the other side to believe that there are still good people in the world and that things can work out. Sometimes when you're in a real dark place, be it because you're depressed yourself, chronically or otherwise, or because you have a bad upbringing or you don't have the right role models or whatever, the best thing you can do if you're going to date someone is date somebody that is really stable and had all the things that you didn't. And I think that's a lot of why they butt heads and it doesn't work out. And of course, neither of them are really there because they're head over heels in love with the other one, and that's part of the problem too. They want different things. He only wants approval from his father, while she wants popularity, and he already lives in a public limelight, so he isn't maybe super popular, but he's seen that side of life. Bob the Hun, $5 super chat. I'm just going to keep hopping back to these because they're coming up so much tonight. And thanks so much for the support, everybody. Really appreciate you. And I know I'm long-winded as always. I hope you're enjoying the show. I've seen people credit Batman 89 and Jurassic Park with the popularity of PG-13. Sort of intense and violent, but you can still take your kids to it. Yeah, it's that have your cake and eat it too, where you can impress your 20-somethings that want some carnage in their movie, but you're not going to give a 9 or a 10-year-old too many nightmares. Okay, I'm going to break down my favorite things about this movie. I like that it's got some grit, like we were just talking about, and that doesn't go too far. It actually is accessible. It's not trying too hard at that, and it surprisingly kind of succeeds at that. The effects are usually pretty well integrated. There is some dated stuff that doesn't hold up great. But at the time, I remember there being a lot of CG shots that I didn't... Even if I would have known they were CG, if I looked real close, it just didn't jump out at me, so it never occurred to me, oh, this is an animated character jumping around. And, pardon me, there are a couple places where I still can't tell, where in the commentary, you're told by Raimi that you're looking at a CG model, and I'm like, oh, I guess so. I didn't realize that. So that's neat. It seems like it's not lazy about the CG. It does everything practical when it's able to, and so the CG stuff in Jurassic Park had this too. We just talked about that last night on a commentary we did, that even if the CG is kind of shoddy by today's standards and doesn't hold up the best, the fact that so much of the movie is done practically makes it easier to not have as much uncanny valley and to not be taken out as much by that stuff. I like the gradual evolution of confidence in Peter Parker's powers. I think that's handled really well. The first time he's swinging around, he's kind of freaked out and he has no idea what he's doing, and it looks like he could crash into something or fall at any point. The first time he swings, he hits a building real hard. That transition was always really jarring and strange to me as a kid. I never really liked that, where like he hits the wall and goes down, and then immediately he's running back home. It's kind of funny the second or third time, but the first time around I'm like, what is even happening right now? Is it? Oh, he's running home. And why is it dark so quickly? It was like really bright outside. How long did it take him to get home? Was it like a 3-hour train ride? I was wondering about that. But anyway, I like the gradual evolution of his confidence with his powers, because that reflects his emotional maturity as well. I like that Peter almost becomes a criminal after his uncle dies, like he could be one of his own bad guys, and that was right after he told Ben he wasn't going to turn into a criminal. He says, what are you, afraid I'm going to be a criminal? And then an hour later, he's got a real good chance at going that way himself, or a couple hours going that way himself. I like how sparingly Jameson is used as a comic relief character. Less is really more with that. He's there just as much as I think he needs to be, and we still get a bit of a sense of humanity for that character when Green Goblin shows up and he won't deliver Peter Parker to him. He pretends like he doesn't even know who he is. We've only seen him be mean and yell things at people, and it's funny, but it's funny because he is kind of a terrible person, and he does libel and slander. He says it's libel, and he's basically a tabloid that pretends to be a real newspaper, and he's straight off the comic book page. I think that's why a lot of people love that character, and he's wonderful. But we have that one moment to tell you there is a person in there. You're just not going to see it fully realized yet. I wish we went farther with that in the other movies. I wish we got to a place where we could really, like Stan Lee does, break down why he hates Spider-Man so much, because he kind of has the Lex Luthor thing, where he doesn't believe it's possible for a person to be that good, and he has to tear him down, because if there is someone that good, it reflects poorly on him. And I wish we got to that, but you can see an inkling of it in the first movie, and that's great. The mirror scene, like I said earlier, when Norman realizes his opposite personality killed the board, is wonderful. It's maybe my favorite scene of the movie. And it's interesting that both Peter and Norman internalize all their problems and have no one to talk to about them. I think that's kind of part of the problem, really. And if only he had... I've never thought about this. If only Peter had actually come out and told Uncle Ben what was really going on, maybe all of this could have been avoided. This has the best villain laugh in anything, I think. I think it is my favorite villain laugh. Maybe equaled with Nicholson's in '89, because it's really good too. And there's some other good Joker laughs and things, but I don't know, as far as favorites go. The fight in the burning building is really well choreographed, and the effects look solid. There's a lot of scenes that I could say that about, but particularly that one always stood out to me. And I think there's a lot of iconic things in this movie. I think that's definitely one of them. Some wonderful storyboarding. I love particularly the shot of the trolley car and Mary Jane in each of the lenses with the sadistic choice scene. And I like the grit in the last fight. We just talked about that. Raimi is playing to his strengths and doesn't turn the thing into a horror movie. I already said that. Here's a few things I don't like. Peter is too passive. I talked about that. Recedes into himself too much. That's going to be built on, and he's going to turn more whiny later. Like, the there's little inklings of the things that I really detest about both of these characters in this first movie. The problem is just that they're interpreted to be straight up those characters in later movies, and it always hurt this one for me, looking at this as a franchise. It was easier for me this time around to just watch this as a movie, and those things don't take over, and they're few and far between, so it doesn't ruin it, but it's unfortunate that became the whininess of Peter Parker, the crying thing. Like, he cries in one scene in this, and it's fine. It makes sense that he's doing that. And the kind of entitlement and selfishness of Mary Jane later on. She's not quite as spunky or confident as I imagine she was on the page. And you can say, well, she doesn't have to be, again, just like she was in the comics. She's a little bit of a reinvention. But there's something about some of the dialogue she has that makes me think that the interpretation from the actress is a lot different than what was intended. And I think it might have been better if it was handled more like it might have been on the page. Again, not sure what the Goblin wants to accomplish after the board is killed. I've complained about this forever. He's just a Power Rangers villain. He wants to rule New York, apparently. He set his sights a little bit higher. He kind of acts like New York is the whole world. Sometimes it feels like that in Marvel things, though. There's a couple of little conveniences here and there, but it's not anything like Amazing Spider-Man bad. It's usually like little details. Like, it's kind of convenient that Peter just happens to run into Mary Jane on the street in front of the diner she works at. It's not a small town. I complained about this with Daredevil. This is not as bad as that, the Daredevil movie, but I mean, in the same movie where you have the line, there's 8 million people in this city, you also have 2 people that just happen to run into each other, and yeah, maybe they just each spend more time in that particular area of town, but that's a little easy. I've never liked the setup with the alley scene where Spider-Man and Mary Jane have their famous kiss. That's a warm moment. I get why it's iconic and beloved, and it's taken right out of a comic page, and that's cool. But the setup for it is way too movie-ish, if that makes any sense. And again, it's a somewhat stylistic movie, but it just sort of feels like, and this is the moment where the thugs have to show up and go attack the girl in the alley so that the hero can save her. It's so contrived. So yeah, that's too easy. Also, even for 2002, it's a little weird that our damsel in distress has to be saved 3 times in the movie. It's like she's got one for every act. I think 2 of the times that she gets saved must be in the second act, but she has a save for every act. People have complained about this for years. Spider-Man needs more quips. He would seem a little bit less mopey if he joked more often. The few times we get it, they're fine, but they read a little bit, did your husband give it to you? And he says some things in his regular costume. But they kind of read like they're obligatory, like a lip service. It's Spider-Man. He's got to have those moments. It should happen a little bit more often. The MCU movies have gotten that more right, I think. This is one that really kind of bugs me. It's too easy, and it's a trope with movies that Peter realizes the Goblin is going after Mary Jane just because Aunt May says everybody else knows. That scene in the hospital when she goes, would it really be so dangerous? And the whole point is at the end, he does decide it's too dangerous. Would it really be so dangerous to tell Mary Jane everybody else knows? You go, oh my goodness, you're right. And maybe the Goblin also knows. It's maybe okay that he puts that together and gets worried and paranoid and runs off. The timing is just too easy. The revelation comes right after she's been kidnapped. So I can see the writing on the page there. Yeah, again, Goblin needs more of a motivation. Norman tries to... I can't decide if this is a problem or not. Norman tries to reconcile with Harry. It seems just so that's the last thing he remembers of his father before he dies. Again, the timing is just a little bit too easy. It is Norman and not the Goblin, so I do kind of buy that scene, and I get that he's realizing all of his mistakes, and it's too little too late. It's a sad scene. I think it plays really well. The timing of it kind of reads like, oh, this has to happen, because otherwise what plays out at the end where Norman is so upset about his father's death and blames Spider-Man and everything is not really going to work, because you need them to have reconciled to some degree for that to happen. Okay, if anybody wants to ask any more questions or make any more points of your own that you'd like me to read, go ahead and drop those right now, and I'll scroll up and look at a few things, and then I'm going to go to some questions. I did this last week. I made a lot of the review for Attack of the Clones, questions I had about the movie, and I had so much fun with that. I said I wasn't going to do this, but I ended up writing some down for this movie too, and it'll be a little bit different because a lot of that was, I don't understand anything that's happening in this movie, and with this one, a lot of it is just kind of like fun little, I'm not sure what the motivation was for the movie for this, or fun little nitpicks, and a few this doesn't make sense things, but this isn't me saying this movie doesn't make sense and it's totally awful and the whole thing falls apart. Just a few kind of disparate points I want to make by way of question mark. AMC, okay, so Cap, let me try and explain the Goblin's motivation past where the board is killed. I always thought it was meant to be read as defense mechanism for Norman, much as in TAS. Oh, that's interesting. Do you mean that the Goblin takes over more because now he's committed murder and Norman wants to be even less in the driver's seat? That's interesting. That it could be that. But I want the personality itself to be doing something a little bit more interesting than... Because the problem isn't... And I meant to mention this earlier. The problem isn't just... This might be in questions. The problem isn't just... what does Norman want after the board is killed? I know for years I've complained about that, but it's also more just the Power Ranger villain thing of you've forgotten that you might want things of your own, and it's all just about the hero now because his name's in the title. He just goes, I want Spider-Man to join me because he's got powers. Together we could rule the whole city. I don't know, like, you got a glider and super strength, and you got a guy who also has some super strength and can swing and is really agile. Like, I bring the whole army down upon you guys, and I think you're done. I don't think that's really going to work out. But it kind of just becomes about, there's a hero, and I've got to take him down. I got no plan whatsoever after that. He just gets so preoccupied by Spider-Man. I never really understood exactly why that is. Bob the Hun, Elisha Dushku should have been Mary Jane. Agree or disagree? So apparently she screen tested with Peter Parker, with Tobey McGuire. I thought that was fascinating when I found out about that. I meant to watch the tape for that, and I forgot about it. I didn't do that. So I'm going to do that a little later, but unfortunately I won't be able to talk about it here. So I didn't see how she read it, so I don't know. But she doesn't seem like exactly the right body type or personality type for this. And I love Dushku, don't get me wrong. So maybe possibly I would have never thought of her for that. But I need to look at that, and I wish she had a bigger career. Cinematographic, here's my review of the movie, Cap. See chapter 1 of Into the Raimi-verse, 1.75 out of 4. Wow, that's a pretty low score. AMC, I mean, in the mirror scene, the Goblin states his mission is to do what you won't, to say what you can't, to remove those in your way. He then goes on to state how there's only, and then he just trails off. Yeah, but that's the thing is, he kind of makes it more about what he wants then, right? Like, what does Norman Osborn care about Spider-Man? Like, they're not linked in any way. It's just, oh, Spider-Man has powers like me, and I either want him to work with me or I want to get rid of him. And I sort of get the logic of that, of, like, he might be able to stop me, but keep in mind, he didn't stop the Goblin from doing the only thing he went to the Unity festival to do. He shows up and he blows up the board, and then they have a fight, and then Goblin leaves. He didn't stop him from doing anything. There's no reason that he should necessarily think that Spider-Man's that big of a threat. I think AMC Comics, he keeps going. The one who could stop us, implying that even though he failed this time in saving the board, he could be a problem down the road, hence Goblin's fixation on Spider-Man. Yeah, maybe. I guess I just wanted a little bit more talk about it, and a little bit more of a sense of what his endgame past beating Spider-Man was, because there clearly isn't one in the story. Okay, I'm going to read down some questions. I'm going to do this very quickly. Feel free, this is the last call for these, feel free to put in another question or comment if you are so inclined. Why is Peter so enamored with Mary Jane? We kind of talked about this already. And again, I'm feeling a little bit better about it even after I wrote that note, but I just don't like the whole like girl next door thing with them. That becomes a trope that feels like Smallville did it too. And I guess it might have made even more sense in Smallville with Clark and Lana being in such a small town, but it's handled even worse than it is here. But it plays like a lot of us are supposed to relate to that, and I don't know how many people have really even had that experience. I don't understand this line. Early on, there's a line that the general guy has where he says to Norman, "I never supported your project. We have my predecessor to thank for that." I don't know what he's talking about. Who's his predecessor? What does that have to do with his hatred for Norman Knotts? I don't understand that. How doesn't that wrestling outfit get sued on a weekly basis? I'm not going to go into my rant again like I have before about the $100 for 3 minutes thing. Like you pinned him in two, so you get 100 instead of 3,000. But I don't understand how what looks like a pretty high-profile gig is getting away with stuff like that all the time. We got a couple more super chats here. Bob the Hun, $2 super chat. Dushku wanted to be Black Widow in Iron Man 2. That I like. That I'm buying more. Batman Rocks, $5 super chat. This would be a 2.5 out of 4 for me. So yeah, here's some... We're already getting into tweet-length reviews from the live viewers. We'll do the pre-written ones from Patreon here in a little bit. But I should have said that earlier. Tweet-length reviews is a thing that you can do on Patreon at the $5 tier or above. And you can also do it in super chat form. This would be a 2.5 for me. Super unpopular opinion, I know, but The Amazing Spider-Man 1 understands Spider-Man more as far as his journey to being a true hero. I like a lot of things about that origin better than this, certainly. I think as a movie, overall, this kind of holds together better. Weirdly, I think... I don't know, like, there's technically more interesting things on paper, thematically maybe, with the villain, but the villain plot itself really goes off the rails at the end, and, I don't want to sit here and just review that movie again, but, the best angle that had, I don't know, it's too convoluted and it's built on too much, like I said earlier, of a series of contrivances, and conveniences, but, I do like that characterization of Peter Parker better, and the romance is better, and I really like the idea that Peter very nearly goes to a revenge place, even more so than he does here, and turns that into Spider-Man, and then looking at a kid that he has to save wearing the mask makes him change his mind about what that symbol should be. That's fantastic, and I think that's head and shoulders above a lot of the ideas in this movie. So like that improves on it idea-wise for me, but maybe not so much as a viewing experience. Like I actually would rather sit down and watch this, I think, but I think I'd rather in some ways talk about and write about that other movie, even though I'm somehow almost 2 hours into this. I wrote a lot of notes. I over-prepared for this one, I think. I've complained about this before, so I'm just going to say it and move on. How did Peter pay for and build his costume? He only had $100 to his name, and he had to make a makeshift costume, and then he gets his regular costume because it's time for that to happen. In the movie, how doesn't the whole cafeteria of kids who saw the webbing incident and the flash fight not know who Spider-Man is later? Somebody should put that together. There should be a Coleman Reese in that scene. Why are mechanical web shooters too heightened for this world? Or maybe Raimi... I actually don't know the story behind this, if there is one. I didn't see anything about this in my research. Did Raimi have an explanation for the natural webbing as opposed to the biological web shooters as opposed to technology, or is it just that it kind of goes better with his horror roots? Like it's weird. I can see why that would be a fun thing for him to do, but also he really wanted to take things as close from the page as possible. When I was a kid, I assumed, or when it came out, I guess, when I was in high school, I assumed that it was because somehow the movie thought that was more realistic. See more super chats here. Bob the Hun, Dushku would also have been Black Cat in Spider-Man 4. Was she actually cast, or they were talking about casting her there? Because I know there's some pre-production on that movie. I don't know how far they got with that. I like that too. Yeah, get her in here somehow. OAW, $5 super chat. Quick review. I still think this film captures the best spirit of Spider-Man. Part 2 is still my favorite, but I consider it a 2-part piece. I think that is totally fair. Bob the Hun, web shooters is not too far. It's that Peter could make them on his own. Oh, okay. Yeah, I guess I'm just... If he can make the suit, I don't know. Like, if it's an issue of resources, like, is it too unrealistic that he would be able to invent them? I don't know. Like, I bought it fine and amazing. I'm not sure why I wouldn't have bought it here. But yeah, I mean, all you have to do is say that he is just more tech savvy and knows science even better than he seems to in this movie. Especially after 2, I feel like you would probably buy it. I don't know. That seems kind of arbitrary to me. I'd never had this thought before. Why couldn't Uncle Ben retire from his job before he was 68? He was the senior electrician at the job he had. And what was his 401k? What kind of retirement did he have? Did they not have to give him some kind of a package when he left? You get the sense that they're just flat out broke. Like, he was the senior electrician. You'd think he'd have a pretty decent retirement portfolio. 35 years he's at that job. Was there not a union or anything? All right. Why would Norman think, even if his experiment works, the military would accept his one human trial? I said that earlier. Why would Norman need to trade the roles for a Jetta when he could buy multiple cars? He's rich. Why do some of the kids in the hall... Yeah, I wrote kids in the hall. Why do some of the kids in the hall in the big fight with Flash decide Peter is a freak just for winning a fight? Like, is it just that he does crazy backflips and stuff, and then he does that? Because the way it reads is like, oh wow, this fight is crazy. Look at all these things he's dodging, and like people are kind of just fine with it. Like, they're surprised, but not. He's super powerful, and then, oh man, you hit the guy one time and send him careening on the other side of the hall. You're a freak, Peter. I've never understood that, and I don't entirely get Uncle Ben's response to it either. How does Peter stick to walls through suit fabric? I guess that's always a question. Does Flash know that Peter is with MJ when he shows up? Like, she's there talking to Peter, and he's like, come look at this new car I got! If he knew Peter was there, I feel like he'd either run away or come beat him up. I'm not sure which. But I couldn't... It's hard with lighting sometimes to tell, like, just how dark it's supposed to be, because we need to be able to see it. Can you really buy a used convertible for $3,000? It's a question. Okay, I spent way too much time researching this last night, and I couldn't find the answer. And it's not important at all for this review, but I got preoccupied by it. And I had Austin helping me, and we couldn't figure it out. Who in real life drew the sketches for the Spider-Man costume in the montage, where Peter is drawing the sketches and creating the Spider-Man costume? I always assumed it was a major Marvel artist, but I don't know. And Raimi doesn't say who it is in the commentary, and Tobey McGuire's commentary, he doesn't know either. So... I want to know who drew those. They were sold at auction like 4 years ago, and the auction house on their website, and they sold all of them, or like several of them. I thought maybe those ads would tell you who drew them, and they don't. What did Ben think that Peter should do differently in the fight with Flash? He says, just because you can beat him up doesn't mean you have the right to. But he also says that you're not supposed to run away from the fight. If he was there, he might say, oh, Peter, you're too cocky, you're too excited that everybody's clapping for you and all of that. But, and maybe the hearsay he heard, it sounded worse than it was. He didn't beat him up. He got him away from him. He hit him, and he went, and he went on the other side of the hall. Like, how bad of an injury was it, really? Maybe it's just what the stunt looks like. Why isn't anybody freaked out by the webbing in the wrestling fight? What happens if Bonesaw gets beat? This isn't a thing I never thought about before either. So, Spider-Man didn't have to keep fighting after he beat Bonesaw, but the event keeps going, and because we hear in the background people are cheering and stuff, like there's still fights. The idea was people keep going up against Bonesaw, and he keeps tearing him apart, and then somebody else comes in to see if they can beat him, and then somebody finally beats him. So what's going on after that? You think Spider-Man would stay in the ring, maybe? Did a policeman... And here's the thing. Some of this is comic book, I realize, but I question the logic of it still. The whole power responsibility thing coming out of Peter Parker didn't stop something that he could have stopped, and that choice leads to somebody getting hurt. That being the way we get to the responsibility lesson is genius from Stan Lee. But did that policeman in the hallway really expect an unarmed kid to take on a burglar with a gun? Like, he's not bulletproof, and nobody would know what his actual powers are. You just saw a scrawny kid beat up Macho Man Randy Savage in a wrestling match. You don't know what he can handle, that he can handle a guy with a gun. I've always been told that you let the police handle things like that. Okay, I've been going a long time. I usually don't do this in the middle of a rewind, but I need just a couple-minute break, and I'll be right back, everybody. And then we'll finish this, I'll get to Super Chats, and I'll bid everybody farewell. I am back. Thanks for bearing with me, everybody. Okay, so there's always that question of whether or not Peter Parker should be considered a murderer, and I've always gone kind of back and forth on it. I think in my original rewind 6 million years ago, I said that he kind of looks like it, or maybe he should be held responsible, because he's intimidating this guy, and he's fighting him real hard, and the burglar, and he's got him at a window, and then the guy trips and he falls out. So, like, he doesn't do anything directly. He doesn't directly push him out, but he then looks down in kind of dark satisfaction. And Spider-Man 3 makes it even more complicated when Mary Jane kind of points out that there's kind of this question of whether or not he killed that guy, and it seems like maybe he's a murderer. So I'm just throwing it out as a question. I would be curious to know if who in the audience thinks that in at least in real life that he would be held responsible for that or not. I don't want to say that it's because I was going to say it's a little bit like the scene at the end of Begins. I guess at least I can see both sides of the argument of like whether or not it was right of Batman to leave Ra's al Ghul on the train. Like, does that count as him killing him? He says, I don't have to save you. It's like, does it still count as killing him? It's not the same situation, but it's as much of a question mark for me, I suppose. How is the Man-Drone as effective as a glider by Quest? I asked that earlier. So I remember when the movie came out, hearing rumors that there would be an appearance from Eddie Brock, and I don't remember if I think there was a scene that was maybe written or shot or something that was supposed to have Eddie Brock, and then it was cut. And his name is still in the movie, even though he won't be seen until 3. And I guess we have to just assume in continuity it's a different photographer named Eddie. Eddie must just be a very popular name for photographers, because his last name doesn't come up. But we're told that there's a photographer named Eddie, and he is out doing something else, and so they have Peter Parker get pictures of Spider-Man. So, who's that guy? I guess would be the question. Hey, did you ever think Betty Brant would end up becoming Rita Repulsa? If Osborn is the #1 military supplier, I've been talking a long time, do we really buy that Quest could buy it? Like, they buy them out, like Disney buying out Fox. It seems contrived just to give Norman a sinister motive there. Why is Mary Jane... Oh, you know what? We had a super chat, and I should probably read that real quick. Everybody's talking about Elisha Dushku. Bob the Hun, $5 super chat. Elijah Dushku, man, I really should have done my homework on that. I meant to look at that. I forgot all about it. Elijah Dushku also could have been a great Catwoman. She voiced her in the animated Year One film. I forgot about that. You know what? I think of everything that's been brought up tonight, I think I like that even better than Black Widow or Black Cat. She should have been in some superhero film, also X-23. These are all good ideas. I like all of this better than Mary Jane. And I think that's the thing, is that I see Elijah Dushku as kind of an action hero. So, yeah. Oh, Bob Hunt says she was... Oh, I'm sorry. Fancast is X-23 for years. A bunch of fan art and videos. Well, and there was that rumor at one time that she was going to be a Ghostbuster. Like, people have wanted her in, female action hero roles for a long time. Again, should have had a bigger career. We're just talking about Elijah Dushku now. Anybody else remember when Singular Wireless was a thing? That's the thing that most dates this movie to me. Why is there so much product placement in this movie? It's not Fantastic Four bad, but there's a lot. And I kind of forgot that the Dr. Pepper starts here. Apparently Dr. Pepper is like the main corporate sponsor of Spider-Man, because it's going to be all over too, but you have a Dr. Pepper can that Peter shoots with his webbing, and I always thought that it watched like a commercial in the first place. You get that rousing music, da-da-da-da-da, drink Dr. Pepper! Spider-Man wants some, he's gonna web it and bring it to him. That should have been like the Alfred Diet Coke commercial in Batman. Why does Norman just go with what J. Jonah Jameson called the Goblin in the newspaper? Why doesn't the Goblin take Spider-Man's mask off on the roof? What could he possibly be his motivation for not caring what his alter ego is? And then once he does find out what it is, why doesn't he ruin it for him? It's convenient that he's just a crazy person and we don't understand, we don't have to understand anything about him. He's a really one-dimensional personality that we just get lucky he doesn't do anything really terrible that can't be undone. How does the Goblin know Spider-Man will show up to a burning building? Like, I wonder if there are a bunch of other things that he did, and Spider-Man just never found out about them. And this one, he finally showed up. He's like a moth to a flame, but he's not Superman. Even Aunt May says that. It's not like he's got super hearing and he would always know. Like, it's a big city. Maybe the fire department just shows up and takes care of it. I mean, they were there, and yes, if Spider-Man hadn't showed up, somebody would have died, and that would be very unfortunate, but how does he know he's going to show up there? How is Peter not suspicious that Norman is the Goblin when he sees his arm and then leaves at Thanksgiving? I would think he'd put 2 and 2 together quicker than he does about that. When Aunt May wakes Peter up from his goblin nightmare, there's a voice that says, "Wake up, little spider," and I'm actually not sure who the voice is. I never thought to question that before. Like, is it supposed to be like a normal-sounding Norman voice? Because it's not an evil goblin voice. I'm not sure who says that. I didn't go back and listen to it super close. I just wrote that while I was doing this last watch, and I was like, who is that? Would Peter, I wonder, and this isn't a criticism, this is just me wondering, I'm speculating now, because I think this is interesting. Would Peter have we're 2 hours in, would Peter have responded to Mary Jane the same way? when she tells him she loves him at the funeral at the end. If Harry hadn't just said Spider-Man will pay, like, I wonder if he would have fully embraced her and had a relationship with her if only Harry wasn't making it seem like he could be the next villain that would put her in danger if they were too close. How come Mary Jane always breaks up and tries to get with guys at major life functions like graduation and funerals? It's no wonder she wants to be in drama. If she isn't suspecting he's Spider-Man after the kiss, why does she react like she does? For the sake of this movie, it works just fine. Oh man, maybe she's figured out that he's Spider-Man. But then in the next movie, it's like, we forgot all about that. And she has to do like the upside down kiss thing with Jameson. I guess not John Jameson, not because that'd be gross. But I guess that isn't to figure out the identity thing so much as just to get a sense of if she's in love with him enough. I never really cared for that. I'm remembering the scene of the moment now, but yeah, it's kind of weird that doesn't really play after this. And then, this is another just kind of question I have. This is like an outside chance kind of thing. Who is talking? Because I think I know who it is, but I think there's a possibility, and maybe I'm crazy, but this is a thought I had this time. Who is talking when Norman says, "Don't tell Harry," at the end? That's a repeated line. Interesting that Mary Jane and Norman both say that, and that I found that weird commonality between them, that they both seem to care more about reputation and fame than they do anything else, and they both have the same kind of MO when it comes to Harry. No wonder Harry goes crazy. Nobody ever tells him anything. Don't tell Harry. Is it Norman or the Goblin at the end, just before he dies? He tells Peter, don't tell, he's got his mouth full of blood, don't tell Harry. Maybe Norman doesn't want him to know that he's the Goblin. That's how it's always read, or to me, and that's the way I've always heard people talk about it. Or is it possible that he's still in the Goblin persona? I mean, it does seem like Norman, it does seem like Dafoe is playing it differently, but is there an outside chance that it's like a 3D chess thing, where, I'm going to be conspiracy theorist, where the Goblin doesn't want Harry to know that he accidentally killed himself so that he could blame it on Spider-Man, and the whole thing is a long con to create what happens so that he'll become the second Green Goblin? Is that possible? I think if that's what they did and they made it really clear that's what they did, I would call that kind of contrived and too easy. But I wouldn't put it past a thing like this, and so I'm just wondering if it's possible that's what it is. It's probably not. But that was a thought I'd never had before. Okay, let's look at a couple more comments here. Chewbacca's Lover, thoughts on the theory that Aunt May knows he's Spider-Man? I think that's the case. By 2, I really get that sense. I don't know if she quite does by this point. Thomas Lowe, it has to be Norman. I tend to think that's probably true, but it was an interesting thought. Tony Casero, if you were to do a Spider-Man in high school, a Spider-Man in high school period piece, what decade would be most interesting? It'd be fun to take it back to the 60s. Certainly, and I think a lot of people have that, think that would be cool, and give it kind of a little bit of an edge, where maybe Peter has some of those same innocent sensibilities, but we, go back to the Stanley comics again, but we make it maybe a little bit more realistic, but still set in that period, and kind of deal with the politics in the background of that period. I think that could be really cool. Beyond that, maybe go back to the 90s, just because that's when I was growing up and reading Spider-Man, and my Spider-Man is kind of a 90s character. I meant to say this too. Well, of course, in the 90s, he's not in high school. I mean, the Spider-Man I grew up with was an adult and married already. And so even though this was real true to source material in a lot of ways, I didn't appreciate that because I hadn't read any Stan Lee yet. Spider-Man wasn't a high school kid to me. And in the 90s show, to match more the books that were happening at the time, he wasn't in high school either. And I never really appreciated the Green Goblin that much because he came much later. Like, that show starts with Hobgoblin. So I was all over the map. I was all messed up with Spider-Man and appreciating what it used to be and where it all started from. Chewbacca's Lover 70 Spider-Man is my Spider-Man. I mean, there's some great stuff there, of course. Okay, let's go ahead and go finally to tweet-length reviews. I always apologize, but I'm sorry I've been at this for so long. I'm going to totally throw my voice out. I'm just having so much fun doing the show this way, you guys. I want to thank everybody for being here and for, again, the support and all the comments. And I'm sure I got a lot of cool ones earlier that I didn't get to. We're well past 2 hours, so I'm going to have to keep going here. But let's go ahead and read these tweet-length reviews. Chewbacca's Lover, who we've heard a lot from already, put in a tweet-length review. And again, you can do this at the $5 tier on Patreon. I love this movie. A little bit hard to be objective, but I think it holds up as well as any superhero film from the 2000s. I remember the hype and seeing it in theaters when I was 7, 2 out of 4. Michael Gulick, flawed overall, but I've grown to appreciate it more for its distinct, consistent charm versus modern Marvel homogeneity. Not everything I want from an adaptation or particularly high art, but being easy to enjoy for its simplicity and earnestness make for a great comfort food movie. 2.5. I liked it a lot. Comfort food movie, absolutely. Which is interesting because it has a kind of downer ending. Whether you really buy that that's what Peter, should do in that moment. It worked better this time around than it ever has for me before. I think I'm kind of, I think my view of that has always been tainted by all the TV that does that really poorly, and that kind of starts here. At least this is the first place I remember really seeing that. Well, I guess Smallville first, but yeah. Victor Herman. Spider-Man reminds me most of the 90s Batman movies, where style and tone were king, and story and characterization were secondary concerns. Despite that, I find myself charmed by this colorful movie, by its simple morality tale, and its embrace of cheesiness, and that trails off. Apparently, I didn't get the whole comment copied. Where did I pull this from? I will try to go find that. Sakib, pretty great for the memes it gave us alone. 3 out of 4. Christian Ogden, beyond cheesy, beyond dated, and beyond fun. The action scenes feel a little stale compared to other Spidey movies. The CGI has not aged well at all, and the dialogue has moments of pure Star Wars prequel awkwardness. Did I get to my point about dialogue? Because I had that in my not so great things. But yeah, I'm with you on some of the cheesy dialogue. Like I'm okay with Peter being as kind of cheeseball as he is to some degree, but a lot of the romance writing I think is kind of overwritten, and I don't know if melodramatic is the right word, but anyway, I agree with you. But the performances are enjoyable, the villain memorable, and you just can't deny how important this movie is for the history of the genre. Yes, of course. It's one of the gold standards for superhero origin stories for a reason. 3 out of 4. Let me see if I can find the rest of that tweet-length review real quick. Yeah, here it is. Again, Victor Herman. Spider-Man reminds me most of the 90s Batman movies. Style and tone were king. Story and characterization were secondary concerns. Despite that, I find myself charmed by this colorful movie, by its simple morality tale and its embrace of cheesiness, which, unlike the modern trend, it manages to do without making fun of itself or its source material. 3 out of 4. Yeah, I was kind of alluding to that earlier, but you articulated that much better than I did, that it isn't too self-aware, and sometimes there's a balance. There's a line you got to walk. There's a certain amount of self-awareness you want, but it isn't constantly self-referential, and it's not like apologizing for being based on comic book source material. Absolutely. John, subject 879, a good, almost great superhero origin that delivers one of the best villain performances ever. We've had better Spider-Man movies since, but there's a charm to this one. 2.5 out of 4. Really good, well-written reviews this time, you guys. I applaud you, and quite a few this time as well. So we have just a few more to go. Doolittle, a fun, charming superhero movie. It got me into Spider-Man when I was a kid, and I think it still holds up as an entertaining popcorn superhero movie. 3.5 out of 4. The Congregator is a new face to the Patreon producers. A great introduction to the character of Spider-Man, a required viewing for all superhero fans, 3 out of 4. Connor Nielsen, in 2020, right before the pandemic hit, I had the chance to visit New York City. It was amazing, and I think Sam Raimi captured something like it with his first Spider-Man. The world and melodrama capture a sweeping bigness in their simplicity. A world without superheroes discovering Spider-Man for the first time is a lot like an outsider's first experience in the Big Apple. 3 out of 4. That's really cool. The Day Ghost. This is Austin. Sam Raimi is awesome, and Spider-Man is awesome. Together, they're pretty cool, but are just short of reaching their full potential. 3 out of 4. Yeah, it's great. I'm going to go ahead and rate the movie now, and I think, even though I enjoyed it better than I used to, again, I've kind of come full circle. I still don't know if I can go any higher than a 3, just for some of the character complaints, motivation things, like story-wise. I don't know if it's quite beyond a 3. There's a part of me that wants to bump it to a 3.5 just because I'm appreciating it more, but I don't rate things as much as I can help in any way based on the importance and the history. Like, I talk about that, of course. How can you not? But the story analysis at the end of the day is what the number is about, and I think I'm going to have to stay with a 3. Yeah, so my rating has not changed, even though I did, I think, give this a more positive review overall. I certainly lobbed more complaints at it, but I also gave it more accolades, and I talked about it for way too long. How are we at 2 hours and 20 minutes? I don't know how this happens. I don't know. Pace yourself if you're watching this later on. We're so far down the line, it doesn't make sense to say that now. But anyway, let's go ahead and try to rank the movie now. I'll put it in my ranked list, and this may be nigh impossible. So it is currently, so of course it has to be with all of the 3-star reviews, and since I'm not changing the rating, it's going to stay right here. Or pardon me, it's going to stay in with the 3 stars. It's funny because I compared it so much to Batman 89, and they are right next to each other right now. I've got 89 just above it. I don't think, story-wise anyway, that really makes sense. I think the more we're talking about it, it's a better story than Batman 89. It's got a third act that certainly sticks to the landing better, and the whole thing is more cohesive as a narrative. So I need to put it above that. Would I put it above Doctor Strange? Would I put it above Age of Ultron? I kind of want to move Deadpool down 1 or 2 notches, maybe. And then Ninja... This is all so arbitrary and difficult because I love all these movies. I don't know if I could put it higher than First Avenger. Mask is tough. Yeah. I don't know. I don't know where to put it. I really don't. I think it's got to at least, based on this review, go over Batman, which is difficult for me to do. But I think that's just right. And then that Doctor Strange. And then those two next to each other is really weird because then Raimi directs the second Doctor Strange. So yeah, I think for right now I'm going to put it in the 43 spot. I'm going to move it up just 1 to the 43 spot. Guys, thanks so much for hanging out, bearing with me. Hope you had a good time. And whether you watched this live, whether you watched it after the fact, I want to say thanks as always to all of our patrons, and especially our Superhero Rewind Patreon producers. We have overhauled the $10 tier. We've had some new takers on this. It's been going really, really well. If you are curious about that, you can go to patreon.com/geekvolution, and you can read all of the perks that you get at the $10 tier. The producers get more than just their names read in the show now. They also get to converse with me in a Discord, a private Discord about superhero movies. We've been doing a lot of that, about particularly the thing I'm working on. They will sometimes give me background to look at, and sometimes I'll forget to look at said background, but it's like the douche-coo thing, which was in there, but super cool of folks to do that anyway, and I will try to keep up with that better. I just completely forgot to look at that last night. I watched another commentary. I watched 2 commentaries this week, and the movie, so it was quite a bit of viewing of the same movie. But it says something that I enjoyed it 3 times in a row. And anyway, a lot of really helpful things that they do there. It's a lot of fun, and we're going to meet in a couple weeks and once a month to talk about the show and superhero movies, and to sometimes even do a private viewing screening of a superhero movie together. So thanks to all of our Patreon producers, and I'm going to read your names right now. Thanks to Zach, Wendell Jones, Thorne Jones, probably no relation, Michael Gulick, Kareem Roberts, Jacob Schneider, Damon Begay, Checkers, The Inventor, Thomas Edgehill, The Day Ghost, Super Billy, Stone Gassman, Michael Martin, Joshua Gulasano, John Sandoval, Chajira, Hot Soup, Goofster123, Elliot Slater, Dylan Musciello, Chewbacca's Lover, and Blake. You guys are great. This was such a good time. Next week, so I'm going to be out of town all this week, and I'm not going to have time to prepare for a movie, but I'm still doing a show next Sunday. Don't panic. I'm trying to keep this weekly as much as possible, so I'm doing another show that is going to require a lot of help from you guys, and I'm making things very interactive now, at the risk of looking lazy. And we just did a non-review show a couple weeks ago, and with the Back of the Box show. It was a lot of fun. It went really well. I'm going to do another one of those, and this time we're going to be talking about the history of superhero movies, and it's going to be the What If show. I'm going to take lots of questions from you guys. I'm going to write some questions down myself. We've done this kind of thing on the Captain Logan show, but this time it's going to be specifically superhero movies. I'm probably going to read a lot of these in the first place and at least think about it a little bit. I don't know how much I'll write down in the way of notes. I don't know how prepared I'll be, and how prepared I'll have time to be, but we're going to get together and we're going to go through several what-if questions about the history of superhero movies. If things had happened differently, movies not coming out, movies that almost came out, coming out instead, actors being different, stories being what they at one point might have been and then got changed around, what have you. What would the world look like now in the landscape of superhero movies? And that's what we're going to be talking about. It'll be the What If show. We're going to do that on Sunday. And then I have a poll up right now for the Rewind selection board for Patreon producers, again at the $10 tier. And you can help me pick from a list of 5 movies, including, I forget all of them, but including Nick Fury, Agent of S.H.I.E.L.D., that weird TV movie from 1998, and Power Rangers from 2017, Suicide Squad is, the first Suicide Squad is on that list, and a couple of others. So go check that out and help us decide if you're so inclined. That's already up, and I'm going to be doing that in 2 weeks. And in the meantime, you guys are great. Thanks once again. I will see you again in a week, and hope to see some of you guys with more content this week. Just going to be a couple of videos while I'm on the road. We're going to be not doing regular content this week, and I will be doing probably a How We Felt About on Jurassic House, which I'll see, or Jurassic House 2, Jurassic World Dominion, which I'll see while I'm on the